Hello and welcome to another episode of Pakistanomy. My name is Uzair Yunus, and we're going to continue keeping our focus on the US presidential elections. Last week, for those of you who tuned in, I had Nayara Haq on, who talked about the Pakistani American diaspora and the elections and the decision by the Pakistani American PAC to endorse Donald Trump. And we talked about that, and we talked about what's at stake in this election. Got a lot of feedback, some good, some quite angry from Pakistani diaspora uncles. But that's par for the course given the views and the emotions around the elections. And today we're going to be talking to Shadi Hamid about the Muslim American community and the conversation in the broader Muslim American electorate around this election, particularly in the context of the war in Gaza and what's happening there and that expansion of the war into Lebanon and what's at stake for the broader community. For those of you who don't know, Shadi Hamid is a columnist at the Washington Post and author of the book, The Problem of Democracy, America, the Middle East, and the Rise and Fall of an Idea. He also co-hosts a wonderful podcast called The Wisdom of Crowds. The links for his column, for the book, and for the podcast are in the description. And the reason I'm having Shadi on in particular is he's been doing a lot of thoughtful writing and having a lot of thoughtful conversations over the last year, particularly around the war in Palestine and what's going on and how it's impacting the electorate here in this election cycle in America. So, Shadi, first of all, welcome to Pakistanomy. And second of all, thank you for having and engaging in that discourse. I know it's not easy to continue to do that, and I've learned a lot from your writings and work. So appreciate all the work that you've done in that space.
Yeah, well, thank you, Uzair. Thanks for having me, and I appreciate that and look forward to our conversation.
I want to begin, with this framework that I've had in my mind, right? And it goes as follows. There's a big divide in the community, in the Muslim American community, even in the Arab American community. And, largely speaking, it's not a monolith. There are Lebanese Americans and Palestinian Americans and Pakistanis and Indians and, Indonesians, etc. And the lived and shared experiences are different, but on the issue around Palestine in particular, there is this unification, right?
Yeah.
And what we're seeing, the community broadly speaking coalesce around this idea that what's going on is a plausible case of genocide, and at least that's how many frame it. Since October 7th, that the Biden administration has been woefully short in terms of its response in restraining Israel. And that's being diplomatic, right? So the base case, people will say
Hmm.
that that's where we are. A lot of other people have much stronger feelings about that, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. But in my mind, I see this as almost like a inflection point for the community, the way it happened post Iraq War, which the community, largely speaking, generally speaking, leaned Republican, and post 9/11 started swinging more towards the Democrats, anchored itself in the Democrat Party post Iraq, and sort of 2016 and 2020, in a way, was peak sort of support for the Democratic Party in the community itself. 67% or so Muslim Americans voting for Biden, for example, in Michigan, a very critical state. So I see this as an inflection point right now, that this election in a few days will give us that data to maybe say, okay, there's a switch beginning to happen. How do you see sort of the Muslim American electorate and how it is participating in this current election that's ongoing right now?
Yeah. Well, it is definitely an inflection point. I agree with that. I haven't felt anything like this post 9/11. I mean, after 9/11 was obviously a very difficult time for our community. And then there was the invasion of Iraq and the aftermath. So we've had all these key moments in the past 20 years, but there's something different this time. And I think we all feel it. You know, the Iraq War, as devastating as it wasn't as if the US or the Bush administration was waking up every morning and thinking to itself, we want to kill Iraqis or devastate Iraq. There wasn't the same kind of, there wasn't really, I mean, we can debate about some of that, but I don't think that was the intention that was undergirding the Iraq war. I think what's different about the war in Gaza is that the Israeli army is completely indifferent to Palestinian and Arab suffering, and that would be putting it nicely. I would say that there's a deliberate intent to harm civilians and to destroy civilian infrastructure and to make Gaza uninhabitable. So, in that sense, it's not quite comparable to Iraq. Um, and also, I think there's not even the pretense here of the US aspiring to noble ideals. At least in the case of Iraq, there was a kind of moral language. There was this idea of self-determination for Iraqis that after that, or that democracy was part of the calculation there. And we can say that we don't believe that and it was all nonsense, but at least the language was used. But here there isn't any of that. What essentially the Biden administration has been saying is Israel has a right to defend itself, that the US is not going to do anything to stop Israel. And in that sense, there isn't even the hypocrisy. And I'm someone who believes that there should be at least a little bit of hypocrisy in foreign policy, because hypocrisy is how we establish the gap between who we are and who we want to be. With hypocrisy, at least we know we're aspiring to something better, that we should be more moral, that we should be more just. Here, there isn't even that. The mask has come off entirely. And it's terrifying to see the mask come off. And that's part of why I think this is really a decisive moment. And the other part of it is that the double standard is just so blatant that the Biden administration simply doesn't care about Arab and Muslim suffering. And we've always known that in a way. We've known that, going back to the Iraq war, we've known that the US doesn't care about Arab and Muslim lives as much as it should. But now it's just at a completely different level than anything that we've seen. So I think for a lot of us, and this is what I've been saying in my own kind of public speaking and writing, is that we know now, and we can't, it's undeniable that Arab and Muslim lives are expendable, that we are seen as lesser than. We simply, and that's a hard thing to realize, that your own government, your own president isn't able to empathize with the suffering of people who are like you or look like you. And we know from the very beginning that Biden was questioning the death toll. So even when Palestinians were dying, he couldn't even muster the respect to talk about Palestinians as if they were equal human beings deserving of dignity. So I think all of that means that there's something visceral about this moment that most of us haven't felt to this degree before. And that's why I think there does seem to be a realignment or a de-alignment. Maybe de-alignment is a better term to use, because it's not as if Muslims are realigning with Trump or the Republican Party. It's more that they're just thinking about leaving the Democratic Party, or at least choosing not to vote for Kamala Harris, that in particular. And whether that means that there's going to be a shift to the Republican Party in the future, I'm actually more skeptical of that. But at the very least, there's a sense that the Democratic Party has betrayed us.
Yeah, and I agree with that, right? And I mean, the way I look at it, you said it's like we've known that there's a hierarchy of life, right? And the way I sort of explain to even my friends abroad is we all have hierarchies of life. For example, like many of us don't care as much about the Rohingya in Myanmar or the Sudanese in the Sudanese civil war as we do about Gaza. And that's our, as a community, if I were to generalize hierarchy in a way, if we were to think about it. And in the Western world, there's a hierarchy where, you know, a hospital being bombed, and this is an experience I had, for example, at my former institution, at the Atlantic Council, and the video is public, it was a public event where you had, I think, a Polish journalist talk about how Russia is committing genocide, cultural genocide in Ukraine, by bombing universities and places of culture, etc. And mind you, this is February or March of this year when he was talking, right? And I'm just sitting in the audience and thinking, well, isn't this ironic that we're talking about
Mm,
cultural genocide in Ukraine, right? So that's the hierarchy from a Western civilization point of view, right? That, oh, the big
yeah.
bad Russians are doing this. But of course, when all of the universities in Gaza are bombed and destroyed, that doesn't count as cultural genocide. But the way then and that hierarchy in my experience, South Asia, covering South Asia, is like when the United States left Afghanistan, there are still about 40,000 Afghans in Pakistan, for example, that are eligible for asylum and refuge in the United States of America.
Huh.
We don't even want to talk about them anymore. But I would be very surprised if that were to happen, let's say 2 years down the line in Ukraine, if let's say the Russians were to take over Kyiv, right? We would get everybody out into the Western, all of our Ukrainian allies into the Western ecosystem if that were
Yes.
to happen, right? But my question to you related to that point is, given that this hierarchy exists, and we've all been reminded of this hierarchy, particularly in the case of the Democratic Party, how do you think about this choice now in a two-party system that we are stuck in? That on the one hand, you have at least some space in a Democratic Party to engage on this topic, and there's a generational shift within that party on Palestine and Gaza, versus a MAGA Trump Republican Party that doesn't even allow that conversation to happen, that is fundamentally captured by an evangelical right wing Christian view of Israel that is at its core. How do you think about that, the conversation,
Yeah, look,
given that those are the choices?
so as unpopular as this may be to say, I actually do hope that Kamala Harris wins. I mean, I've wavered and on this topic and gone back and forth, and I'm torn and conflicted, and I see the arguments for not voting for her, for abstaining. I get where people are coming from, that ultimately, for many Arabs and Muslims, it's a matter of conscience, that they have to be able to live with themselves, with their choices. And when you're at the ballot box, it's just you and then God. And that's a very weighty thing. And I get it if people can't bring themselves to vote for, quite honestly, a Harris campaign that has completely disrespected Muslims and Arabs. So I totally acknowledge that. But at the end of the day, in a two-party system, whether we like it or not, it is a binary choice. And one of the two options, Harris or Trump, will be the next president. There's no way to get around that. And we have to, I think, ask ourselves a very simple question. Who do we prefer to be our president for the next 4 years? And as I get closer to election day, the idea that we could actually have 4 more years of Donald Trump, I'm just like, I can't do this. I don't want to do that. It's putting aside the Middle East for a moment, it's not going to be good for our country as Americans. Um, just the level of polarization and the fact that no one will be able to escape politics. I mean, let's not forget when Trump was president, he was in our heads all the time. He made politics into just a very intense, everyday, you just got to deal with his tweets, deal with his crazy statements. And so I think at that's and so that's one part of it for me. But I think what you just pointed to is really important, that the Democratic Party is still a more hospitable place for Muslim Americans. I feel I can't imagine being in the Republican Party because they kind of just don't like Muslims. And there aren't many Muslims, at least when it comes to the party apparatus or serving in senior levels of the Trump administration. There were very few Muslim or Arabs, and for obvious reasons. But the Democratic Party, by contrast, does have a new generation, as you said, of young Democrats who are openly pro-Palestine. It was a live debate at the senior levels of the Democratic Party, congressmen, senators, and so on as to whether we should make aid to Israel conditional or whether it was worth considering suspending arms. That wasn't just Bernie Sanders and a couple other people. Senator Chris Coons was talking about that in the spring. And Chris Coons is a kind of traditional Democratic senator who's known to be pro-Israel. Even he was starting to wonder. So I think what that shows us is that there is room for debate in the Democratic Party. And my view is that we should build on that. And 4 years of Harris will mean 4 years of having a seat at the table to push our views and to advocate for our views and to try to make the case internally in the Democratic Party that we have to put more pressure on Israel. But there is no pro-Palestine Republican senator or Republican member of the House. Maybe there's one. I would have to even think about that. But it just shows that there's a completely different discourse in the different in the two parties when it comes to this. So those would be just two things that I would highlight in terms of how I'm making my own calculations. And we also have to remember that Donald Trump has a record. His 4 years as president, he moved the embassy to Jerusalem. He recognized Israel's annexation of the Golan Heights. He was the architect of the Abraham Accords, or at least his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, was.
He
The
kicked out the
Abraham,
Palestinian ambassador from
yes, that
Washington.
too. And the Abraham Accords, let's not forget the whole premise of the Abraham Accords was to do an end run around the Palestinians and completely sideline them. The idea was to do a peace process without Palestinians. That was the Abraham Accords. And we want to go back to that kind of approach. When Jared Kushner says that he wants to make Gaza into beachfront property, or Kushner said that we should let Netanyahu, quote unquote, finish the job. And I just think it's very easy for Muslims to look. I'll just say this again, that Kamala Harris has been utterly disrespectful towards the Muslim community, especially in Michigan. But that doesn't mean we forget Donald Trump and the people around him, what their record is on this topic.
So building off of that, right? The pushback I get from people, both here in terms of the community conversations I have, but even from outsiders who are watching at this election from the Palestinian lens or the future of Gaza lens, right? Is that, hey, they're like, look, and I think they would say the same thing to you, like, Shadi, look, like the Democrats are just, wolves in sheep's clothing. They pretend to care and they talk about a rules-based order and human rights and things like that. And Secretary Blinken can, put up a good act about how concerned he is about what's going on. But at least with Trump, you kind of know the Powell package you're getting, right? So you're going into this bargain with your eyes open. And then they say, you look at Trump's 4 years in office, he doesn't bomb Muslim places. He's not a forever war guy. He doesn't want American entanglements abroad. And so he's going to be better. That's the logic I hear. And I was wondering how you would respond to that logic and if you've also come across a similar
Oh,
train
look,
of thought.
yeah, I hear this a lot. Look, I think there is a kind of appeal to Trump because he's unpredictable. Because he's so unpredictable, it's theoretically possible that he could do anything. So you can imagine him getting angry at Netanyahu and not wanting to be humiliated by Israel and saying, guys, stop it, Israel. What you're doing, it's not making me look good. I think that with Trump, all bets are off. So I think that's why people are like, well, we have the devil we know, which is the Democratic Party and the Biden administration. Trump might be just as bad or worse, but at least there's a sense of we're not exactly sure what he'll do because he's a madman. He's crazy. He's all over the place. He vacillates from one extreme to another in 2 days. And so look, I get that. I would just qualify one thing is in when we look at Kamala Harris, she's not the one who's responsible for the Biden administration's policies. And that's worth remembering because I think there's this tendency to say, well, Biden has been terrible, yes. Therefore, Kamala Harris is his VP, and that means that she's complicit. Yeah, she's partly complicit, sure, but the vice president doesn't, at least this vice president, was not really one of the deciders when it came to the Biden administration's approach. And we know this just based on the reporting of how certain decisions were made. You know, she's a secondary actor in this administration when it comes to foreign policy. So we actually don't know for sure what a Harris presidency would look like or what Harris herself would actually want to do. Now, her rhetoric has been disappointing, very disappointing as a candidate, but I think it is worth distinguishing between Biden and Harris and not treating them as being interchangeable. But again, but yes, going back to the Trump issue, I think people have this idea that he is going to end wars because he's saying that. And this is where I actually give Trump some credit. He's trying to court Muslims and Arabs in these final weeks, and he is saying things like, I'll end the war. But we also know that Trump talks a big game and he'll say whatever it takes. And he likes appealing to different constituencies and showing that he's on their side. Um, and that's why I wish Harris could actually be out there the way that Trump is. Trump has had a number of tweets and posts on Truth Social. He even had, I think it was just earlier today actually, a whole post about how he would be good for Lebanese Americans and good for Lebanon, and how he recognizes what Lebanon is going through. And it shows that whatever his intentions are, it shows that he's taking our community and paying attention to us. And the same can't be said for the Harris campaign. That's why I wrote a piece recently in the Washington Post, my column, where I'm just like, the Harris campaign needs a wake-up call. And Arabs and Muslims are trying to give her that wake-up call, but she's not listening. And this is a big mystery to me. Why isn't she listening? And it's a major unforced error. And if she loses, she'll deserve it. And she'll only have herself to blame if it tips on Michigan, because Michigan could make the difference here. Ultimately, it's going to be her fault for not taking our community seriously. And that's why I'm not actually very sympathetic to her predicament. I would prefer that she's the president, but at the same time, I get it. If she hasn't earned our vote. She hasn't earned our vote.
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, in a democracy, you should have to be out there earning the votes instead of taking them for granted. So in that
And
way, I'm sort of, yeah.
no, I was going to say that's been sort of one of the things to me that's been super frustrating, right? And I hear this all the time, particularly from people in the Washington Democrat bubble, that, oh, Uzair, like, look at Trump, he's so much worse. Like, really, the Muslim American community is gonna make that bet. Like, he put a Muslim ban on and he like calls you coming from shithole countries, etc. And I'm like, all of that is good. And the analogy I use is, if I'm going to a Subaru dealership to buy a new car, the salesman has to sell me that car. If the salesman pitches Mercedes, Ford, GM, all of them are crap. Therefore, you're just stuck with me as the Subaru is the only choice you have. I'm like, I'm sorry, I'm not going to buy that car. It's as simple as that. I'm human. You got to make the pitch to me about your product and why you matter. And I think that's been the most frustrating part, is whether it's arrogance or something else. You said a unforced error about not even wanting to woo the community. Even if it comes down to, okay, we know Muslim Americans are not a monolith. There are groupings within them. Am I going to, engage with parts of them the way Donald Trump did? He had like some of his people are having meetings with Yemeni Americans all of a sudden, right? And like, that's interesting, right? Or Lebanese, as you indicated as well. And I was wondering, like, from your perspective, like, is it just that they are ignorant about this perspective of the community that you got to earn our vote? Or is it arrogance? Or is it just that they're plain old scared to just rattle this conversation too much, where it comes down to haunt them on other constituencies, particularly the pro-Israel bloc within the party and the big donors in particular, and AIPAC, that she doesn't want to go down that path.
I think part of it is fear. Kamala Harris doesn't like doing anything that puts her in a challenging situation. That's why she was avoiding media interviews for the first part of the campaign, because she's not actually good on the fly. She's good in scripted situations. So I think that they have this fear that when you're around Arab or Muslim Americans, they're going to criticize you and things are going to get awkward and people will get angry and they don't want to deal with it. So they almost, it's out of sight, out of mind. We don't even want to confront that possibility. And I think that you can see her, how she tenses up whenever Gaza is brought up. She has a pro forma response that she gives whenever it comes up. Oh, inhumane conditions, the suffering of the Palestinians. But it's the same thing she says each time. And if you'll notice, she never mentions who's causing the suffering. It's almost as if it's a natural disaster. Oh, look at those Palestinians, they're suffering. But there's no acknowledgement
And then she
that,
pivots to grocery prices.
yes, exactly. That's what's so offensive. Yeah, it's almost like she wants to just move to a different topic so quickly, and you can see it. She's not comfortable. And I think what the Harris campaign doesn't quite, maybe it doesn't grasp this. We as we as Muslim and Arab Americans, we're not asking for a lot. At least I'm not. I try to be like fairly realistic about my expectations. It's not as if she's going to come tomorrow and say, we're going to stop aid to Israel or we're going to stop sending weapons to Israel. That's not realistic. And I honestly, it wouldn't even be good politics. You don't bring up something completely new in the final days of a campaign and cause a new controversy in the media and all of that. But what you can do is address a community and give them respect. We want to be seen, we want to be heard, we want to feel like we matter. And and because at the end of the day, voting is it's an emotional thing. I mean, sometimes people will say to me, well, why are you guys being so emotional? You're being irrational. Do you really want they're almost like using emotional blackmail to say, oh, you don't want to vote for Harris? Then, oh, look what you'll get. Oh, you want Trump? Okay, let's see how that goes for you.
If
It's a
I may
very
interrupt, that's where
patronizing.
I liked your conversation on the last episode of Wisdom of Crowds, right? Where you sort of created this new converted figure of Kamala Harris who believes in,
Yeah.
who's pro-life, right? And I think that made me think, I was like, yeah, would it be fair to say to people like, oh, you still got to vote for her because she's so much better on other things, right? And I was like, that's,
Exactly. Yeah. Like we all have our a single issue where it's a deal breaker for us. So the example that I brought up is if she converts to Catholicism overnight and she said that she no longer supports the right of a woman to choose and to have access to an abortion, it would be understandable if a lot of women, but also some men, would just be like, this is a deal breaker for me. There's no way I can vote for someone who doesn't support the right for an abortion. And you talk to anyone, and they're always going to have one issue, or maybe more than one issue like that, that is very personal to them. It just so happens that our personal issue is Gaza. So I don't think there's anything unique about Muslim and Arab voters in this regard. And again, it's not even really about policy. It's just about um, talk to us like we're human beings, that we deserve to be heard. Instead of doing things like what the campaign did, this one incident, for example, where they kicked out a prominent Muslim Democrat from an event in Michigan after he was invited. He was seated and two policemen were waiting for him outside. It's just like, what in God's name are you doing? Or sending Congressman Richie Torres to Michigan, and then Richie Torres, who's like a major pro-Israel figure in the Democratic Party, and he was bragging about how there wasn't a single Palestinian American at the Democratic convention in August. What kind of message are you sending? That's the kind of stuff. There's no reason to do that. That's just bad campaigning. That's just bad tactics. And we see that. And it's again, of course we're emotional. Why wouldn't we be emotional? I think I see every American is kind of emotional in the lead up to an election because everyone's freaking out because we know that a lot is at stake. So I don't like it. So yeah, we're being emotional, but so is everyone else.
Yeah, and I think that's a very important point, right? Again, like going back to Kamala Harris and what she stood for a few years ago when she was in the primary, she was anti-fracking, and now she says she's okay with that because she's
Yeah.
had conversations and sort of figured out that, it's not a great policy position to take in a tight election. But my perspective on that is okay, there's a constituency of people, particularly in a place like Pennsylvania, who are okay with fracking, and you got to win their votes. And so, if you're going to run for president and have a realistic shot in your calculus of winning Pennsylvania, you're going to make a U turn on that position that you had 4 years ago in the primaries. And that's okay for both the pro fracking Pennsylvania constituency to demand that of you, and for you to do it if you think that this is going to help you win a very critical state without which you probably lose the election. And I'm like, if that makes sense, then why is it that much more problematic for you to use that same logic for Muslim and Arab Americans and say, here's something. Again, be realistic. No one's, I think anyone who's saying, announce that there will be an arms embargo on Israel tomorrow when she comes into office, if she comes to office, that's not the ask. The ask is treat them as human beings, empathize with their families, talk about not just the right of self defense for Israel, but there's a right of self defense on the other side. Like, why don't you talk about terrorism in the West Bank, right? I mean, it's very interesting to me, and you've been doing this work much longer than I have been, that terrorism, when it occurs and as heinous as it is on Israelis, is talked about as terrorism by Muslims. But when terrorism is committed by Israeli settlers, it's extremist settlers conducting
Yeah,
acts of
right.
violence. And I'm like, terrorism is a politicized term. Use the right term. But you don't even want to do that, right? So I think that to me, at a personal level, is what frustrates about this entire election. I want to talk about another part of this because you've written the book on sort of the democracy transition in America's failed policy of democracy in the Middle East, and it's been years and years of failure. And it's a conversation, and the reason I bring it up, it's a conversation in the Pakistani American diaspora, particularly given the democratic backsliding in Pakistan, the Biden administration's relative silence about that backsliding. Many in the diaspora believe that the United States played a role in ousting Imran Khan from power, and we don't need to get into the complicated politics of Pakistan. But I just wanted your perspective on between the two options on the table, right? Overall, how do you see their role potentially from a foreign policy point of view when it comes to standing for things like democratic rules and norms in the Muslim world, or rule of law or human rights? Like, you're an expert and you've been studying American policy on these topics. Like, where do you see the difference here when it comes to matters of democracy, human rights, and rule of law in the Muslim world?
Between the parties,
Yeah.
I mean, both parties are really bad. Like, I guess that would be the short version. Um, I think a lot of us have been I spent a big part of my adult life trying to push for a more pro-democracy approach in the Middle East. And there was a moment of hope, I think, in the first few months of the Arab Spring when it seemed like Obama was moving in a positive direction. But we fell back to our old ways of supporting autocratic regimes. And it's been very frustrating because supporting dictators doesn't work. The idea is that it leads to stability in the region, but we can see that it doesn't. Does anyone look at the Middle East over the past 20 years and think this is a very stable region? So even if we don't care about values or morality or human rights, dictators don't bring stability because they don't have the consent of their own people. because it goes against human nature to think that people can just accept being subjugated and oppressed indefinitely. At some point, people are going to break and they're going to say, "No, we want something more." And that's precisely what happened in the Arab Spring. People said enough is enough, and they'll say it again. We don't know when, but eventually it will happen. It could be 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, whatever. So, and it's worth also remembering that like Barack Obama is a good example here because he's someone who was the son of a Muslim, the stepson of a Muslim, lived in a Muslim majority country, also was friends with probably one of the leading Palestinian American academic, Rashid Khalidi. They would have dinner, and Obama was open about this. He actually gave a toast to Khalidi in the 2000s when he was before he was a senator. So he was, and he knew Edward Said as well, the great late Edward Said. So I think Obama was a very interesting experiment because here's someone who knows about the Palestinian cause and is clearly sympathetic to it. He also sees Arabs and Muslims as human beings, or so it seemed. But he's also the president who was known to privately joke, and this was revealed in the famous Atlantic profile of Obama that Jeffrey Goldberg wrote that came out in 2016. He Obama was known to privately joke, "All I need in the Middle East is a few smart autocrats." He would also joke, why can't the people of the Middle East be just like Scandinavians? He had a kind of disdain towards Arabs. Like, why can't they get their act together? Why are they always fighting? Why can't, and he would talk about like, why haven't Muslims gone through a reformation? He would use these old tropes. He also talked about the Shia Sunni conflict as being a millennia old hatred, millennial, this kind of idea that they've always been fighting. These are the kinds of ideas that Obama bought into. And I guess obviously he was frustrated because he saw that the Arab Spring wasn't going in a good direction, and he soured on the whole possibility of democratic change. But it just goes to show that there is this deeper undercurrent in US policy of not seeing Arabs and Muslims in as that there's an exception to the Middle East, a Middle East exceptionalism. So what can you say? I mean, it's disappointing. It's more than disappointing. But what I keep on going back to is it doesn't work. Supporting dictators is not an effective policy. So I think what we have to do as Muslim and Arab Americans who care about these issues, we have to advocate within one of the parties. And this is where I go to your question. There's no constituency in Donald Trump's Republican Party for supporting democracy in the Middle East. Trump is notorious for not caring about that at all. He brags about how much he likes dictators. He called Sisi, the Egyptian dictator, his quote unquote favorite dictator. At least the Democratic Party, at least Biden talks about the importance of democracy abroad. He doesn't act on it. Again, I know that. But Trump doesn't even pretend. So on the broader set of issues, I mean, they're both bad, but I think one is worse than the other.
Yeah, and I would agree on that, right, as well, like that you look at the rhetoric and going back to your earlier point on like why hypocrisy also is important, right? Because it reveals the gap between
Yeah.
who you want to be versus who you actually are. And somebody can actually hold you to account for that or pressure you to change and be a better version of yourself by saying, look, like,
You're being a hypocrite.
you're being a
That's a good
hypocrite,
thing
right?
because
There's shame involved in that.
yeah, because no one says to China or Russia, "Oh, you're being so hypocritical," because no one expects that much from China or Russia because they're not democracies. They don't aspire to any kind of moral mission. But that's the same reason that Trump wasn't seen as hypocritical because he didn't even pretend.
Yep.
So you couldn't even criticize him for the gap between words and deeds. So you're
Yeah.
just like, oh, we have to accept Trump as he is. He doesn't even care.
Yeah, exactly. And I think so again, that again is like if you're thinking through, if you're in the audience thinking through, okay, what are the options here? It's not a great situation to be in the first place. That's what we're talking about. But there are certain things that you ought to consider with nuance when it comes to the choices on offer here as well.
And I'll
Last
and I'll
point.
just add one thing on
Yeah,
this. We've been talking primarily about foreign policy, but domestic policy and the fact that Donald Trump doesn't respect democratic outcomes at home, the fact that he wants to politicize our federal agencies and weaponize them against his enemies, and he's talked very openly about that. Do people really want to go through 4 years of Donald Trump using the apparatus of the American state to go against his political adversaries? I mean, at a very basic level, we have to like if you're an American, you have to live under this.
yeah,
And I think people have to think through very carefully what 4 years of Trump will look like. I don't think he's going to end American democracy as we know it. I think that's complete silliness to say that American democracy will die if Trump is the leader. But will he challenge democratic institutions? Will he test them? Yes. And I don't think that's good.
yeah. No, and I was telling, I tweeted about this as well because a Pakistani American uncle sort of pushed back at me on a phone call after my last podcast saying it's intellectually dishonest to say Donald Trump is a white supremacist. And I was like, I'm not even going to go down that argument with
Yeah.
you. Let's not even bother. But then it prompted me to tweet and say, well, if you think that you're a rich doctor or an engineer from the Pakistani American community or the Lebanese community or whatever, um, and you think empowering white supremacy is only going to lead to some sort of action against Jose and his friends from Venezuela, then you're mistaken. They're gonna come from the Jose's, the Gibrans, the Jonas of the American community fabric as well, because we know from history that when white supremacy is empowered, it doesn't care between differences of color or ethnicity
Yeah.
among people of a foreign nature who are poisoning the blood of the American white Christian republic.
Exactly. Yeah. At least Democrats actually come to the defense of American Muslims as they did during the Muslim
Yep.
ban period. And under Donald Trump, the climate is just going to be very negative and very polarized, and people who don't like brown people like us are going to be empowered. And again, it's easy to forget that because it feels like a long time ago, the Trump years. But I remember, like, it felt like a dark time.
Yep.
I remember that. I'm pretty sure I remember that.
I think most people do as well, but it's like kind of this nightmare that you
Yeah,
parked
you
away
almost,
and don't want to remember anymore. So the times feel good. Last question to you, Shadi. You've been sort of engaged in the broader foreign policy discourse around the Middle East, around democracy, around how to think differently about US quote unquote national security priorities in the region, right? And like it frustrates me even on the South Asian side as well because things fall victim to very narrow, mostly counter-terror interests in that part of the world. And it's frustrating to a lot of people, particularly younger people that I now talk to, and they say that there's no point in engaging. There's no point in doing anything about it because it's not going to lead to any change. And my view on this is, well, no, you got to keep engaging, and things take a long time to evolve. And we look at sort of slow and steady evolution as something that is part of the American system over time. If you take a longer time horizon on very problematic, thorny issues. And I was curious to hear your point of view of like, if you're sort of talking to somebody who's dejected with the state of American politics, particularly American foreign policy and national security policy, given everything that's happened over the last year, plus going back to the war on terror
yeah.
and everything that has unfolded since then, how do you convince people to sort of not lose hope in this period? And also, what is it that people at the grassroots community level or otherwise ought to be doing now and into the future to make that change happen that they want to see in policy in
Yeah.
America?
Well, look, what I try to remind people of is America is a democracy. That means we have agency. We have some influence over the policies that our government implements. Maybe not as individuals, but through the collective force of organizing and advocating and trying to scale that up, you can actually make changes. If we didn't believe that, then why would we even be in this country? I mean, I think part of the reason so many of our parents or grandparents came here, there was, of course, economic opportunity, but there was also something nice about having some basic freedom of expression and having some kind of say over your own destiny. We're not a dictatorship. We're not a perfect democracy. There's no such thing as a perfect democracy, but we have input into our system. Otherwise, we wouldn't even be having this discussion right now. We're having this debate because Muslim and Arab voters matter at the local level, and they could actually change the results of this election. That's pretty impressive. That means something. So, you know, even if it seems hopeless, what do you get if you just say, I'm out of the system and I'm giving up? Then, then for sure nothing will ever change. But you have to play the long game. And these things do take time. And quite honestly, we haven't done a good job as a community. We're wondering why more politicians don't prioritize the Palestinian cause. Well, there's an obvious reason because Muslims and Arabs don't give enough money to candidates. If we were actually able to pool our resources and coordinate our efforts and put our money where our mouths are, then maybe we could actually persuade more candidates to take Palestine seriously. We can't just expect it to happen without any effort. And this is where I think, some Islamic inspiration can be relevant. Ultimately, we're not responsible for the final outcome. That's outside of our hands. That's in God's hands. What we're responsible for is for what we can control, for what we can do as individuals and then also as a community. And then, but we're not even doing that. That's the first step. And that's what God expects of us, but we're not even doing that. So let's not worry so much about the outcome because we don't know how to anticipate that. And again, things take time. But at the end of the day, we're judged based on our intentions and our effort. And that's what we have to do. And if we say, oh, we're done, we're not going to care about our country, we're going to give up and just I just don't see that's an abdication of our moral responsibility. I believe not just as Americans, but also as Muslims. That doesn't mean you vote a particular way. I think it doesn't mean you vote for the candidate that I prefer, but it does mean that you're active. And it does mean that you try to work within the system or even work outside of the system, but in a way that tries to move things forward and is constructive instead of just burning things down and saying, who cares, or what's the point of anything in this kind of nihilistic approach, which won't get us anything as a community.
I think that's a very important point, right? I would also add, like, I think this was in December last year. I was talking to somebody in Houston, and there were protests going on, and they were engaging at the local level in their community with local elected officials, one of whom came to give some remarks. And, this person made a remark that I didn't even realize that there was this big of a Muslim community in this constituency, because this is the first time I'm hearing from you about issues you care about, or even seeing your presence on other issues that the community cares about. For example, issues related to chronic homelessness or crime, or issues related to Black Lives Matter when it was sort of at its peak back in the pandemic Trump era. And this was like an interesting conversation because I was like, yeah, well, that's the thing, right? We also not only need to organize amongst us and sort of look at the core principles and values we want to engage on, but also build those coalitions, right? Because there are a lot of other communities in the American fabric that face similar challenges that we do as a community. And
Yeah.
again, not only on foreign policy, and we can talk about that for a long time, but also on domestic issues about racism and Islamophobia and other types of phobia that impacts a lot of other communities. And if we don't connect that together, then obviously there will be this disconnect between us wondering as a community, well, why don't they care? Well, you got to also put in the
Yeah.
groundwork of building that coalition. So I just wanted to add that. Last question, Shadi, I always ask my guests. Again, thank you for your time, and this has been a wonderful conversation. Um, what are two or three books that you recommend? And any sort of closing remarks from you on few days to go to the election? You've touched on a lot of things in terms of how people should think about their choices. We're not here to tell them how to vote, but anything else that you feel is important for the audience to consider as they sleep on these last few nights for those of us who haven't voted yet in this election.
Yeah. So I can maybe just share with listeners and viewers my favorite novel of all time. People are into that. I'll just put it out there. It's called Light Years by James Salter. I believe it came out in 1972. Um, it's such like just such beautiful writing. I read it a couple years ago, and certain sentences and paragraphs still sort of linger in my memory. He's such a wonderful stylist as a writer, but it's also a really profound book about the disillusion of a family and dealing with grief, loss, and disappointment over the broader sweep of one's life. Um, and maybe this is like another book. It's not really a book as much as the study Quran is. I've been sort of diving into it. It has a lot of just wonderful interpretation of Quranic verses in a way that is accessible to a general audience. And I sort of have it as if I want to understand any verse of the Quran in a deeper way, I go to the study Quran. And having the verses in English in a kind of modern translation, but also having the tafsir or in deep tafsir of particular verses, I've just found very helpful at a time when I'm just thinking more about spirituality, God, and trying to focus on what's important because politics and everything else, the things of this world, you really do realize how empty they are and how unfulfilling they are, and that you need to sort of reach for something that gives you a stronger grounding. And I think that, especially if Trump wins, it's going to be a difficult time, and we're going to have to re-anchor ourselves in family, faith, friendship, our local communities. So I thought I'd mention the study Quran as a resource in that regard. And then I would just say as a kind of last piece of advice is maybe it would be along similar lines that we should be engaged in politics, but we also have to realize that politics is never going to give us the things that we really want. It is going to be it's going to be a place of imperfection. And I think understanding that politics is imperfect is important because it allows us to lower our expectations. So we go into politics with a kind of prudence, with a kind of wisdom, and we say we're not going to get everything that we want, and we shouldn't get everything we want. If we're really looking for deep satisfaction and fulfillment, we're going to have to find that in other spheres of our lives, not through the political, but through the spiritual, through our communities, and through the people that we love. I know it's a little bit of a like a little maybe a little bit sappy and sentimental, but it's just worth maybe reminding ourselves of that in these difficult times.
Yeah, that's a very, very good point, right? And just to share at a personal level along similar lines, like through the last few weeks, one thing I've been thinking about at a personal level has been, you're raised Muslim and you're sort of, a lot of imams, and my mother often talked about this as well, that there are layers of how you deal with things you consider bad or evil around you, right? The highest level is that you physically try to stop it from happening.
Yeah, right.
So if you see a crime happening or somebody holding somebody on gunpoint, the highest level of belief is that you put your life on the line to protect a woman who's
Yes.
being mugged by on gunpoint, for example. maybe you can't do that, so you call the cops around the corner, right, as you exit the alleyway, right? And the lowest level is that you hold it in your heart and you know in your heart that this is wrong, but I can't do anything about it at this point because I'm powerless. So I'm just going to communicate spiritually to my Lord and say, I disagree with this, but give me more power one day for me to do something about it, speak about it, write about it, engage with
Yes.
others on this, right? And I think that's where I've been thinking about this as well, that from an electoral political standpoint, that these are horrible choices, but that the very least what our community can do is be pragmatic, while holding it in our heart and knowing that there are terrible choices on either end of the spectrum here, and we're going to have to deal with one or the other. But in our heart, we're going to hold the fact that this, what is going on in Gaza, what is potentially going to happen with a lot of immigrants if Donald Trump wins in this country with mass deportation, the horror, let's say, people who are non-binary in gender are going to face. We may not, some of us may not agree from a religious standpoint from that point of view, but people will feel a lot of evil coming their way if that happens, and
Yeah.
we're going to have to do something about it. And if we can, in certain instances, that's okay, but hold it in your heart that humans need to be treated better. And perhaps to your point, right, that can allow us to find meaning in other ways where we help people out, despite the fact that we're not politically powerful. So
Yeah.
that's just
Amen to
my,
that. I
yeah.
Yeah. Well
Thank
said.
you.
Well said.
Thank you for your time. Always wonderful talking to you, hearing and reading your work. And we need to meet up in person in Washington. It's been
Yes.
forever. So
Would love to. Yeah.
let's do that. But in the meantime, take care and I'll see you soon.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Uzair, for having me.
Thank you.